Guds frid, älskade vänner, det är allvarliga tider vi lever i och uppenbarelseboken har vi nog säkert kommit in i. Och ni bakom mig här så ser ni ju de här hästarna här med dess ryttare. Vi kommer närmare och närmare det vi kan kalla för världskrig. Vi vet inte tiden, men ungefär mitt på dagen idag så kommer det ett tal från Hizbollahs ledare som kan avgöra om det här ska bli en eskalering eller inte. Det israeliska försvarsdepartementet har nu köpt vapen till oerhörda värden och är beredda på att det blir krig på samtliga arenor så att säga. Missiler, bomber, UAVs med mera har man köpt in till miljardbelopp. Det algeriska parlamentet gav president Tebboune fullmakt att gå in i Israel i krig med 100% positiva röster. Så här har vi alltså i sekel 38 norra Afrika, exakt som det står där. USAs utrikesminister anländer till Israel idag på eftermiddagen. Det var ju också en väldigt konstig tid att komma hit ifall det skulle smälla, får man ju säga då. Blinkens demokratiska administration är tyvärr fortfarande fångad i den dumma föreställningen att Gaza kan förbli som det är och att den palestinska myndigheten skulle vara annorlunda än Hamas. Det har ju visat sig vara totalt fel. New York Times gick idag ut med att den amerikanska arméns MQ-9-drönare opererar just nu i luften över Gazaremsan i jakt efter underrättelser som kan hjälpa till att lokalisera de här kidnappade gisslan här. Samtidigt så arbetar amerikanska entreprenörer sida vid sida med israeliska specialstyrkor för att hitta de här saknande, enligt en annan utländsk källa. CNN går ut med att Syriens president Assad är den som förväntat godkänna överföringen av luftförsvarssystemet till Hizbollah, det som ägdes av Wagnergruppen och som överfördes till syriska armén. Det här är alltså oerhört avancerade missiler tillverkade i Ryssland. Den islamistiska motståndsrörelsen i Irak tillgav att de hade en särskild dödlig kryssningsmissil i sin ägo nu som kommer att användas mot amerikanska mål. Roboten tillhör 351-seriens kryssningsrobot som kallas Qadz-missiler i Jemen. Den uppges ha en räckvidd på över 200 mil. Och som vi nämnde förut då, Rysslands Wagnergrupp förser Hizbollah med ett nytt luftvärnssystem, SA-22. Systemet skulle kunna användas av Hizbollah för att kunna försvara sig mot israeliska flyganfall. Även om leveransen till Libanon ännu inte har skett, enligt uppgifter då, är det oklart om vapnet skulle kunna transporteras till Gaza för att hjälpa Hamas. Om detta är sant kommer Hizbollah få möjligheter att till och med skjuta ner israeliska avancerade stridsplan inklusive F-16 och F-35, till och med ballistiska missiler och potentiellt hypersoniska missiler. Ryssland marknadsförde SA-22 som är ett mycket avancerat system. Det är likvärdigt med USAs Patriot-system och är mycket bättre än Rysslands eget försvarssystem. Gud välsignelse från oss här, och vi håller er uppdaterade på Telegram och hemsidorna så länge. Och nu kommer den här dagliga videon som vi lägger ut med detaljerade bilder ifrån nattens händelser, och vi startar med ett tal av IDFs talesman Daniel Hagari. Gud välsigna er så länge. Amen.
Israel is at war with Hamas. Israel is not at war with the civilians in Gaza. We are facilitating the entry of water, food, medicine and medical equipment into Gaza. Millions of liters of water per day flow from Israel into Gaza. Israel is not at war with the civilians of Gaza, which is why we have encouraged the exit of wounded people from Gaza to Egypt. Egypt is leading this important humanitarian effort together with the United States and others. We encourage this effort. We have expanded our teams to increase the efficiency of this effort. Our war is against Hamas. Hamas does not care about the civilians in Gaza. Hamas steals fuel. Hamas steals fuel from hospitals and uses this fuel for the Hamas war machine. It is because we are not at war with the civilians in Gaza and because Hamas does not care about the civilians in Gaza that we've been calling on the civilians in northern Gaza and Gaza City to move south, away from Hamas strongholds in the north next to Gaza City. Move south, temporarily for your own safety. Move south, it is a safer area than the north. In the north there is intense fighting right now. In the south there is access to humanitarian aid. We will provide corridors for your safe way to move south. Israel is not at war with the civilians in Gaza. Israel is at war with Hamas. We are fighting to free our hostages from Hamas and free Gaza from Hamas.
The Israeli army officially announced the completion of the first step of the operation. It advanced through 3 main points. But the Great War has now begun. Now the most difficult process has begun. The Israeli army is advancing to the cities and record-level clashes have begun. With the Israeli forces completing the first step of the operations in Gaza, a sudden advance began in the West Bank, and a corridor is forming as in Gaza. With the start of very violent clashes in both Gaza and the West Bank, the Hezbollah terrorist organization took action. While Hezbollah launched successive attacks with mortars from the south of Lebanon, it was observed that the Israeli forces responded with retaliation and airstrikes began. While all the camps along the borderline started to be hit, the Hezbollah terrorist organization is expected to officially declare war on Friday at noon. While a great rebellion started in all terrorist organizations, Yemen started firing cruise missiles. F-35s came to the stage. This is the most critical day of the war. Let's start our video quickly without wasting time. Firstly, the first step of the great change took place in Gaza. With the first light of the morning, Israeli tanks and a large number of infantry completed their final preparations. It was observed that the Israeli forces in the central part of Gaza made huge shipments during the night hours. At the same time, small clashes took place in the south of Gaza, and airstrikes continued. With the first light of day, a large number of Merkava tanks and infantry moved suddenly towards the coastal strip. The total distance of the advance was 4 kilometers, so the sudden raid reached the coastline very quickly. In the meantime, the Al-Qassam brigades of the Hamas terrorist organization attacked with anti-tank missiles the Juhur-Adik area on the eastern line, where the Israeli army first started advancing. But the big problem is, the Israeli army has gained full control in the Juhur-Adik region. In this process, it was revealed that there were tunnels used by Hamas in the region. Hamas militants entered the Juhur-Adik area from inside Nuseirat through the tunnels I have shown with a red line on the map and started attacks. According to the statement of the Israeli General Staff, 1 tank was destroyed, but it was announced that the tank was quickly sent to Israeli territory and repair work began. The crew of the tank did not suffer any loss of life. After this process, special forces of the Israeli army moved towards the tunnel point. For 6 hours, unmanned aerial vehicles collected images from the area, while the exact coordinates of the tunnel were reached. Hamas fighters tried to hide the tunnel entrances by covering them with many plants. However, upon detection of the area, special forces opened fire on the militants around the tunnel. After a short clash, the soldiers withdrew and, using drones and armor-piercing ammunition, destroyed the tunnel entrance and most of the tunnel line leading to Nuseirat. Later, special forces arrived at the tunnel perimeter and began checking the tunnel. According to the statements made, 34 members of the Hamas organization were neutralized. On the other hand, the big step of the operation has officially begun. As I mentioned in my previous videos, with the Israeli forces reaching the coastline, the Israeli forces on the northern line began to move southwards. The Israeli forces were joined by new reserve units. However, the area you see on the map is approximately 5 kilometers, and many unmanned aerial vehicles started to observe this area. After the observations were completed, it was observed that the drones entering the area were loaded with ammunition, and attacks began along the coastline. After the attacks of the unmanned aerial vehicles, Israeli artillery on the northern and southern lines started to hit the coastline. The fact that airstrikes have already been carried out in the 4-kilometer area shows that the ground operation will start in a short time. About 1 hour after the airstrikes were completed, the first move came from the northern line. Israeli tanks and armored vehicles moved. A movement was observed in the troops in the south. Probably the Israeli forces in the south have reached the targets that need to be reached today. In the meantime, the rested forces in the north started to move south. Tomorrow, I think the troops in the south tanks have captured the entrance to the city of Beit Hanun, but very intense fighting has started. The infantry is deployed a little further away from the points of attack, because there are tunnels belonging to the Hamas terrorist organization all over the city. During this process, Hamas fighters used the tunnels to exit behind the tanks through 2 points and opened fire on the Israeli forces. With the start of the clashes, urgent air support was requested and 2 unmanned aerial vehicles attacked the point where the attacks came from. As a result of the attack, it was announced that Hamas members were neutralized. This attack by Hamas mobilized the Israeli forces. Extensive artillery and airstrikes were launched on an area close to the center of Beit Hanun. The attacks targeted Hamas's missile launchers and ammunition depots. After the attacks, Israeli tanks were observed reaching the border of the center line. The increase in the intensity of the operation in Gaza caused militants in many different points to attack. Firstly, resistance groups in the West Bank opened fire on an Israeli checkpoint close to the al-Sharayet area. After the checkpoint was fired upon, fierce clashes broke out in the Ramallah area. Israeli forces advanced to the center, but the fighting intensified. However, new Israeli forces were observed to enter the checkpoint, and clashes broke out at the Betunia point. According to the first statements, 8 militants of the resistance groups were neutralized. However, Israeli forces started to be fired at from all points. It was observed that the Israeli forces increased their military presence near the checkpoint. While the number of troops has increased on a point close to Al-Bayra, I think that the clearing operation will begin in a short time. On the other hand, simultaneously, members of the Hezbollah terrorist organization started to attack 4 separate points along the southern line of Lebanon with rockets and mortars. They wanted to target Israeli tanks and outposts on the borderline, but as soon as the first attacks began, fighter jets were mobilized. With the mobilization of the warplanes, all Hezbollah camps in southern Lebanon were hit again. As the attacks increased, the Hezbollah organization's attacks started to decrease. However, as I mentioned, intelligence reports indicate that Hezbollah may officially declare war at noon on Friday. In the meantime, we know that Yemen has officially declared war on Israel. In the evening, 4 cruise missiles were fired from Yemen towards Israel, while 3 cruise missiles were destroyed by air defense systems. It was announced that one F-35 of the Israeli army destroyed the last cruise missile in the air. But tensions have risen considerably. With the completion of the siege, we have entered the most critical period of the war. The Israeli army is naturally hiding what kind of a plan it is preparing, but urban battles are very dangerous. After this process, progress will continue through 3 main points. Israeli officials say that operations will continue until the Hamas terrorist organization is completely cleared. It is useful to state clearly, the next 1 week is very important. With the completion of the siege, I think that all Hamas targets will be subjected to airstrikes, but there are traps and tunnels all over Gaza. This makes urban warfare very difficult. We will see what kind of strategy is made together.